ultimately, it's about people. It's about being able to connect. It's about building relationships. So even if there's less people within an organization, because so many processes have been automated, they still have to be able to interact and connect with each other. And so though I think AI can be really helpful in enabling things, ultimately people need to be thinking about how they're cultivating their awareness, how they're engaging, and how they're calibrating expectations. AI is simply a tool, and you have to be able to apply judgment, you have to be able to apply discernment in order for it to be effective. And if you're not self-aware, you're not engaging, and you're not very clear on your expectations, it's useless.
Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Akua Nyame-Mensah, a former startup executive that now runs a leadership and culture transformation consultancy that helps first-time executives and founders by making leadership simple. Given her leadership experience, I'm excited to have her share her insights with you. Well, welcome, Akua. Can you share with us a story that has shaped the trajectory of your career or success?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. What really comes to mind, so many different stories come to mind. But I would say the first thing that really comes to mind is when I first had the opportunity to build a team and just constantly being reminded that I was wrong. And a lot of the assumptions that I was making, I was making as well were wrong. What comes to mind is I had a team of key account managers, and one of the key account managers was in the office. And she had come back, to the office early from my perspective. And I just was like, there's no way you can be done with all the rounds you needed to do and all the connections that you were meant to build. And she pretty much was kind of like, haha, and sort of showed me sort of on her tracker on her laptop that no, I got everything I needed to get done based on the conversations that we had in terms of the targets that we had set. And so that story, and I can, tell many more, was just a reminder that I'm not always right. A lot of times my assumptions are wrong, and that the best way to go about it was to really engage and to sort of take a step back from some of my, preconceived notions about what's possible, what other people can do. Because a lot of times what I would think to myself is, well, I couldn't have been done that quickly with my rounds and trying to build relationships. So how could she, or how could that person, or how could they, right? Or how could he? And so, yeah, that's the first story that sort of popped into mind. Interacting with one of my key account managers who constantly proved me wrong. And I think it made me really rethink sort of the conclusions we come to based on ourselves and how we can actually be limiting other people, right, as leaders, based on our own perceptions of ourselves and what we are capable of, right? And ultimately, it's about us creating an enabling environment for our team members and making the most of their strengths. And this particular key account manager was much better at building relationships than I would ever be, and could do it a lot more efficiently than I could ever as well.
I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing that story. And I noticed that some leaders are better than others at having that humility and owning up to that, right? And I'm curious for you, how did you kind of arrive to that conclusion where, that's absolutely okay that she's going to be better at building relationships than I will ever be, as an example, instead of being like, that is a threat, I got to eliminate my threat?
Yeah, I would say a lot of it just came from the fact that I was incredibly out of my depth. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what was, in quotes, right and wrong. I think it's fair to say that in some ways I was really naive, but I think the fact that I was naive actually was very much a superpower, because I allowed myself to take a step back, because I recognized I can't do that. Well, first of all, I can't do it on my own, right? I think that all leaders, especially the way I sort of stumbled into leadership, having this opportunity to, build a platform and team from scratch, and having started it by myself and then sort of organically added people to my team, you got to a point where you're like, okay, there's only so much I can do, so I need to expand, and then I need to expand. And then you realized as you expand, I can't do it all on my own. But there definitely is a point where you sort of think to yourself, well, I can do it better, and I have to do it because it has to be done this way. And then you get to a point where I can't, right? So a piece of it, I think, was this natural evolution where it's just like I had to put my hands up and be like, well, if this needs to be done, I just can't do it on my own and I have to let go, even though it's hard. And then I think a part of it is also that I was just incredibly naive. I think that if I had a regular job, and I would say I've never had a regular job. If I had sort of been prior to this been in a regular job where I was maybe starting at the bottom of an organization. So another thing is I've never really been like a regular entry level employee. And I think if I had had that experience, I probably would have felt a little bit more resistance and tried to probably implement something I had seen previously. But because I had never really experienced it myself, you know, you just kind of go with it and you're just like, well, let's see what happens. Let's see what, what's necessary. And the reason why I think it's important to sort of, I guess, identify it more as sort of being naive is because I was in a very unique situation where there were other businesses that actually were within the same space that I was in, right? So I was one of many sort of, at the time, I think they called us like co-founders, managing directors, general managers. And so I had my own business. I was responsible for my P&L, and I had other people in the same exact office, right, that I could look at and see what they're doing. And I was like, always, well, I'm doing it differently, right? And they would always come to me and be like, but what are you doing? Your people seem to listen to you. What are you doing differently? And I'm like, I don't know. Treating them like a human being. And so I could actually see the differences right in front of me as well, while in this particular initial job that I had. And where this story is also from as well.
I love that you called out, like, I treated them as human beings. I think that is essential, right? Because everyone is different.
You'd be surprised.
I know. That's why I'm like, thank you for calling that out. And when you think about just your journey of building a team from the ground up, and as you continue to scale, I'm sure there came a lot of opportunities to learn and challenges, especially when you're like, I don't know who else is potentially doing the same thing. You have no blueprint, right? And I think something that leaders can kind of struggle with is, one is managing the capacity, two is managing the priorities, and then three is communicating and translating that and keep on the same path, right? And steering in the same direction. So what did that look like for you? Like, what was your biggest learning lesson based on that description that I just gave?
I see for a lot of leaders is sort of being within this echo chamber. Human beings, like a lot of us are looking at what other people are doing and sort of defining success based on what we see without always knowing what's really happening underneath the surface. And I thought putting it through your own filter, you can end up doing things that can be really damaging, both for yourself and then your team. And I think that's also the same way as we think about, how do we build systems to share what's important and how do we keep track of what's done? And then I think another piece of that is also how do we celebrate what maybe went well and how do we make sure we recalibrate, right, if something maybe doesn't go our way as well. And I would say I also sort of stumbled through that. I've always been someone, even prior to working full time, who's tried to keep track of things in a particular way. I was that kid with a planner. I'm a very structured person. I think it works to my advantage in some ways and might be really annoying to people in other ways. And I think I was also in a very unique position because I was working at a startup. So no 2 months looked the same. What was defined as success was constantly changing as well. And that can be very, very demotivating. And I think that's something that we don't always talk that much about because I think for some people, they feel like, well, if things are constantly changing, like all these ideas and, it must be so exciting. And it's like, actually, no, that's incredibly demotivating. It's in some ways, especially if you don't communicate it, that's what we would call sort of moving the goalpost. And people, end up being, in this space of like, well, okay, well, they're going to change it. Why should I do anything anyway? Right. And nothing ends up being done. So I would say when I reflect back on that time, I was always trying to use some type of tool to capture what was expected. And I will say it evolved over time. So I'm sure my team back then was really annoyed at me because I always wanted to try the next new thing, right? I'm pretty sure I remember making my team use Slack back in the day. Podio, there was a bunch of different tools. We probably tried Asana as well, all different things. I'm sure we did Google spreadsheets at some point, Google Docs was quite new, but we definitely used different variations of that. So, you want to always have a way of keeping track of those expectations. And I think that when you work within more of a fast moving, evolving environment like a startup, a piece of it also is beyond sort of, having that tool that maybe helps you keep track. Thinking about other channels. So another thing that we definitely had, we tried to have, I think, a weekly meeting at the beginning of the week to sort of set expectations and talk about what happened the previous week. I tried to do one-on-ones at some sort of cadence, and that kind of got difficult to do as my team got bigger. And then I also ended up being in charge of two technically separate platforms across two different countries, so going back and forth. But yeah, I would say it really starts with having those communication channels, thinking very specifically about the tools that you're going to use to keep everybody in the loop, and making sure that everyone's on the same page about what's expected. And I think that's even more important as things are evolving and shifting. And I think that employees should be aware of the fact that things can evolve and shift, because there are some people, like I said, that can get some high, there's some level of excitement that comes with it. But ultimately, right, if you're going to change what success looks like every single day, for some people every single week, that is really difficult for them. And it's difficult for them to have any sort of momentum and be able to move forward. So also thinking very critically about that as well. I think that's really where it starts. And within a startup, a lot of times you don't necessarily have a very concrete strategy, right? So as I think about a lot of the work I do now, sometimes supporting organizations that maybe are a little further along with their strategy, right? A lot of times they tell you, strategy, you should have the same strategy for like 3 to 5 years. Within a startup, it might look a little different. And so it's also important to recognize, I guess, where the business is, really think about what are some of the key hypotheses you have about getting to whatever goal you have within that business as well, right? And so maybe some of those things don't change. So for example, more specifically, I worked for a real estate's classifieds portal. So it was an online portal. And so we were constantly changing the variables we want to focus on, right? So when we first started, we just wanted content on the website, right? So in terms of success, our KPI is like, how much content can you actually scrape from other websites to get on this website? And then the KPI sort of became, how many companies can you reach out to that we scrape their content, and now we want to get their permission to get on the website? And then after you get their permission, how many of them can we convert into paying clients? And then after that, how many can you convert into returning clients? And so, your KPIs are constantly evolving, but maybe it's a bit more about how, right? How you do it might look the same.
There's so many different areas that I want to jump into there, but I'm going to start with this moving goalpost. We've learned from the pandemic. We've learned through anytime there is a change in politician and policies can change right away, strategy, approaches, the how might change as well. So how do leaders keep folks engaged and not kind of go through that change fatigue? And like you said, they throw their arms up and be like, F it, right? Like, this is way too much, and I don't even know what success is going to look like tomorrow. So what's the point?
I think a huge piece of this is sort of keeping in mind some best practices as it relates to change management and transformations. You don't need a PhD in this. You don't need to be a behavioral scientist to know a lot of these things. I feel like a lot of them, honestly, are common sense. But I think that unfortunately, when we sometimes get into a position of power, we kind of lose our common sense in some ways. We kind of, forget, what the air is like down there. And so that's why, earlier on, I just sort of talked about, treating them like a human. A piece of it is trying to potentially empathize. So trying to step into their shoes, if that's something you think you can do. For me, a lot of it was just thinking to myself, like, what would I want in this situation? Simply because, as I mentioned before, I haven't had and still haven't had, what I'd call traditional entry level climbing the corporate ladder experience. And so I guess you can say sort of my filter hasn't been, I'm trying to pick a word here because it's not like it's a bad thing, but I don't necessarily have that blurring, I guess, in my filter because that's not something I've experienced. I haven't gone through it myself. And so with that in mind, I think that there are a lot of really great resources online, but I think the first step is really sort of reminding yourself they're not robots and that they're human, and that any change, no matter how small, can be quite overwhelming, even if they're not willing to admit it, or even if they're not necessarily aware of it, right? Our bodies are constantly calibrating and shifting and changing every second. We just have evolved to not necessarily pay attention to all of those elements. And so I think a bit of it is applying that and also recognizing as the leader that you also have to go first, right? Another key piece I think we sometimes forget as leaders, and I always try and remind my clients, is that your team is not just watching what you say, they're also watching what you do. That doesn't mean that you have to do like everything you expect your team to do, but just recognizing that if they do see some difference between what you say and what you do and you don't follow through, there's going to be an element of unfairness that sort of pops up. And if you look at any sort of like organizational behavior, organizational development sort of research, this element of unfairness is really important, and it drives people to do all sorts of things. And so I would say, as we think about it, I guess a little bit more concretely, is recognizing that in terms of change, in terms of transformation, it starts with the individual first. And so you can't expect for people to change how they do things or for the organization to shift and pivot tremendously unless each individual understands what the change is about, how it's going to impact them, and how they can do something differently. A piece of it might also be reflecting on incentives and, rethinking how people can be incentivized differently. And I think this is where you can get into some really interesting research around how many people should a leader directly manage, right? As it relates to making sure that you have the time, you have the energy to actually engage with your direct reports, to be able to build a relationship where you can have these conversations about transformation or changing or pivoting and shifting, and really recognizing that it starts there. It really starts with the conversations first. Another key piece of this is, once again, I think a lot of this is really just human. And I think a lot of it, even though it's backed by some level of research, is stuff that we have to deal with day to day as human beings. Is recognizing that as things shift and as things pivot, and the same thing is if you're going to change, someone's KPI or target, there is sometimes an element of grieving that's necessary, right? It doesn't have to be like, 20 days, but, just giving space sometimes for people to rant in a constructive way, to talk about maybe how disappointed they are in the fact that their KPI or target of this new thing they have to do is going to cause X, Y, and Z. I always, sometimes even suggest that, allow people to sort of wallow a little bit and then give them an opportunity to think really critically and constructively about, oh, well, we got to change. So what can I do differently? What's possible? Like, what do I need from you, the leader, in order to be successful as well? So allowing people and giving people also time to process, I think, can be really, really helpful. And sometimes something that we really forget to do. We think that all we need to do is say, hey, there's a change. And then people are just going to shift their behaviors accordingly. But unfortunately, as human beings, that's not really the way we work, because we are nothing but habits and routines. And to shift those habits and routines takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of time, and takes a lot of intentionality. And so it's also bringing that into, the conversations that you're having as a leader. That's incredibly important.
You touched on something there that I want to dive a little bit into, and it's that calibration of expectations, and even going back a little bit further to what you said earlier as well, right? Finding the tools to kind of track and kind of maintain awareness of what's going on. As a new leader, or a new executive, how are you supposed to know what you want to track? Because I think sometimes leaders will go towards the end of, I'm going to micromanage the shit out of everything. And then in the end, the team members are like, I'm spending more time tracking this stuff for you than I am actually doing my own work, right? Yeah. And then where team members are also like, okay, I need you to engage me in this solution because I could have saved you X amount of dollars or time from this problem, but you instead chose not to engage me here. So there's almost like this tricky art and science to that piece. I would love to hear how you managed that.
Yeah, no, I really love that you said art and science, because that's actually exactly what sort of came to mind. I don't think, any perfect way, but what really comes up for me is sort of what I call my leadership framework. And sort of, in terms of whatever I teach, whatever I'm doing, the framework that I keep in mind is a really simple 3-step process. And you sort of talked about one element of it. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that this is a cycle. So you can be in any one of these points and you can go around the multitude of times. It's it never ends. You're constantly doing this. And so the first is really around cultivating your awareness. And the idea here is sort of knowing where you are, knowing the expectations, understanding what resources you need, the support you need can help you better to do the second sort of element I always tend to talk about, which is engagement. And for many of the leaders I work with, because a lot of them tend to be overwhelmed or sort of firefighting, it's around simplifying engagement for them. Because for many of them, they tell themselves this story that I don't have time to engage, right? And that's actually a story I used to tell myself. I don't have time. Things need to get done. So I'll just say it one way, and the way I know that I'll understand it and they should be able to understand it as well. That doesn't really work, right, in terms of engagement. And I will also say engagement actually starts within us. So a piece of it's also engaging ourselves. If we've cultivated our awareness and we recognize that something needs to shift within ourselves in order to achieve our goals, we have to engage ourselves as well. And I think that leaders that are self-aware typically a lot better at recognizing what's happening, or at least creating that safe space to engage with others, to help others also cultivate their self-awareness as well, so they can better engage with themselves and others, right? I definitely think that these are things, right, that we see a lot of times. I feel like I've seen it, within the leaders I've worked with, and I think research also, tends to show this as well. And then the last bit of the cycling, once again, it can start at any point, right? I sort of talk about it typically in this order, is that calibrating expectations, right? Which is something that we've talked about time and time again. And I think the key thing with calibrating expectations is, once again, going back to cultivating our awareness around sort of what we tend to be comfortable with as leaders. I would say, and I'm going to really generalize here, but typically leaders are either a lot better at being visionary, right? So they're not really good with the details. They like, seeing things into the future. They like saying, this will happen, but they're not really into the day, So if you're a leader, maybe who's a bit more visionary, what do you need in order to be able to get these details done and to make sure that things stay on track, so that 5 years from now, right, which is where maybe you are talking at, the level which you're looking at, things will get done. And so it's also about calibrating your expectations and, once again, engaging to make sure that you have the right resources, and in this case could be human resources, to make sure that you have those detail-oriented people to support you to be able to make this vision a reality. On the flip side, you have some leaders, and I would say I tend to fall within this second bucket, who sort of got to where they are by being really good executors, right? I got to where I am by just being really good at getting things done. Like, I can project manage the heck out of anything, and I can get things done, and I'm really good at checking things off checklists. And for those leaders, especially if they're stepping into a people manager position, an executive position, they have to let go of that. Right? That's not, what got them to where they are now is not going to get them to the next level. And so for them, as well as in terms of calibrating expectations, a piece of it is them rethinking their role and the expectations they put on themselves. And it could also be about, making sure they create an environment so that they can have the right human resources, once again, to be those types of people. And then maybe also people to help them be more visionary as well, if that's something they feel they need to be, or the tools that can support them to be more visionary, because maybe that's not something that necessarily comes naturally. So that's kind of the way in which I like to have sort of conversations about it. And even when I use other people's, research and thoughts, I feel like they still kind of fit within those sort of three buckets. And I think it helps people gain maybe a little bit of, and I use this word loosely, but some level of control over how they can think about showing up, right? Gives them, I think, a bit of a framework to reflect on how they can maybe shift something or try something different within those three buckets. But I think that in terms of calibrating expectations, always starts with yourself, but ultimately nobody can get things done by themselves, right? We don't live in vacuums. We don't work in vacuums. And so we do need to be a lot more effective at, and once again, I feel like I'm talking about this maybe at the lowest level, but we have to get better at asking for help. We're going to talk about it a little bit differently within the workplace, but ultimately it is about okay, I realize I'm good at this thing, but I can't do this thing. Do I want to build the ability to do, or is that something maybe I can delegate, right? And I can get support in a different way.
I love that visual, and I'm on the same page as you of how leadership in itself and how you develop. It's a cycle, it's a journey, whatever it may be. It's not linear by any means. Definitely. Because every single individual that you're going to encounter will cause you to go back to that cycle again and assess. And then there's life, right? Because life influences you and how you grow as a human being as well. So there's two facets of that I want to dive into. The first one is, how have you effectively led the leader within?
Working at that startup where, I just was really sad, maybe almost crying because of this feedback that I'd received about how I was showing up and how, there's, I guess, a certain expectation. And I think I also sort of put an expectation on myself that I had to show up a particular way as well. And so sometimes as it relates to self-awareness, and I will say a lot of times it's usually hurtful, but a lot of it can be external, right? So you can get sort of external feedback. And, hopefully you work within an environment or you're part of a community that is willing to share that feedback with you. And you have to decide whether to accept it or reject it. And I will say there definitely are some pieces of feedback that I receive. I'm thanks, but I do not shift my behavior in any shape or form because, I sort of think or reflect on my values and reflect on maybe how I want to show up and what that means for these specific goals I've set for myself. And so, as it relates to cultivating your awareness, right, a piece of it can definitely come from, getting some external support. But I think a key piece also is you always creating space. And this is something difficult for us to do sometimes as leaders as well, to reflect on your preferences. And this is something I talk a lot about actually with early stage founders, because a lot of what you do within the early stage is really shaped by your personality or your preferences, to be honest, or your quirks or what annoys you, right? Because a lot of it's just very personality driven. And so you can use and leverage tools to support you to do that. So there are a lot of different types of assessments. There are psychometrics that also can support you. But it's really, really important to realize that these are simply just tools. They're not telling you who you are. And the idea also is that you can't be put into a box, because we actually respond differently depending on the context we're in. We're not, and I know it's a difficult thing for us to sometimes wrap our heads around. And I know this was something difficult for me to also wrap my head around, but like, you're different in every single context. You're different even day to day, depending on how much sleep you got, what you ate, you can show up differently, engage with people differently. And that's why it's so important to continue to cultivate your awareness. So once again, externally, right, you can have people give you feedback, you can use tools and leverage tools, but also internally, trying to think about how you can build your own routines or rituals around sort of even just how you feel, I think can be a really big one, right? So really trying to develop, and as I think about, self-awareness, emotional intelligence, I definitely think is part of that package. Just being able to wrap your head around how you're currently feeling can actually go a long way to help you reflect on what you might need to be successful today, right? So recognize maybe you don't feel that well. Maybe I'm going to take a break today. Or maybe I'll delegate X, Y, and Z. Or maybe I'll make sure I can, lay this until another day. And so you also building up your internal capacity to understand. And I know, as I use these words, I feel like there's so many different words we can use, but I think it's important to maybe mention all of them, like sort of how you feel, what your mood is, and then maybe how you also interpret your attitude. I think a lot of times we use those interchangeably, but they all kind of have different elements to them. And a piece of it also, you can also think about maybe our attitude, sort of what we're thinking as well, how we think about something, right? Because that can also impact how you feel or your mood. I don't know. We can use them interchangeably. I think with research, they all kind of go together, but just creating space so that you can do that. Because once again, I think that we're usually so busy just doing things. And a lot of the leaders I tend to work with are, high achieving, have accomplished so much, and they just want to do and do and do. So they never take a break to pause, to even reflect on how they actually feel or their attitude about something or what their mood might be. And so they can't always necessarily connect the dots between how they're showing up, how they're engaging with others, and how it has to do with whether or not they've treated themselves like a human being. All right. So going back to this idea of recognizing we're not robots. And I think that's ultimately what self-awareness is all about.
I appreciate you highlighting that from the leader perspective and what they can do for themselves. And I think the tricky part is, how do you cultivate that in your team? Especially if someone has a low self-awareness and you're just like, okay, I can clearly see what's going on. And we've had multiple conversations and you still don't realize that there's something wrong. And then they go seek that feedback. They take that feedback back and they're like, I think that's a them problem. That's not a me problem. And then you as a leader are like, no, it's a you problem at this time, right? So how do you help cultivate that self-awareness without making them feel bad about themselves?
It's a tough one. It's an interesting line to reflect on. And it's really funny you're talking about like a you or me problem. I was watching this reality TV show where everyone was like gang up on this one guy and he's like, it's a them problem. And someone's like, but how can all 10 of them have a problem with you and you're just one person? Like, there's gotta be something here maybe you can take away. And the guy was like, no, I don't think there's anything I can learn. And I think it's going to depend on a lot of different things. So the first thing that comes to mind is if I can think about it maybe from different levels. The organizational level, the way I would sort of have a conversation with the powers that be within an organization is really thinking about it from the perspective of what is this organization's values? What is this organization's mission? Do they have like a way of onboarding employees to sort of share what some of these expectations are around sort of cultivating their awareness, engaging with others and calibrating expectations? And so a bit of it, and I always love to use this word because sometimes people get shocked, but it is indoctrination. when you engage with people, and I've had the opportunity to work with many different types of organizations of all different sizes, people sound very similar. And you start to see that people actually kind of think in a similar way, right? They've been indoctrinated to communicate in a specific way. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I just really like the word indoctrination. And the reason why is simply because I also think it helps the powers that be within companies really reflect on what is their role. Their role is to create an enabling environment. And the best way to create an enabling environment is to make sure that employees have a similar foundation and a similar language to talk about certain things. So that's really the first thing that comes to mind when I think about it from the organizational perspective. And unfortunately, I will say, especially with the smaller organizations, or I would say some of the leaders that come to me that are from smaller organizations, they don't necessarily see it as an organization-wide challenge or issue to be solved. Like, this is something within my team. And that's fair, right? So sort of working with a smaller department or with a team, what's possible there? I would say the same thing. It's about replicating what would, within bigger multinationals or bigger companies, what you can do at the team level as well. So really thinking critically about, when you bring new people on, what is the information you want to share with them? And if you don't necessarily have that opportunity to maybe build out something, and it doesn't have to be super complicated, because that's another thing I think a lot of companies think about, like, it's going to cost so much information, so much time, and like, it's going to take so much money. And I'm just like, what's really expensive? Losing employees. Employees not being able to understand how to engage and communicate and get things done. That's expensive, recruiting them and then leaving. So why not invest in something that's going to help, people engage better and sort of help set expectations around, how to talk about maybe some of your preferences, or how to talk about, maybe how we're different in a particular way. And so, once again, at the department level, that's something similar that you can do and think critically about. It can be as simple as a Google Doc that you just have information in. It can be as simple as having onboarding one-on-ones with, your direct reports as they come in. And that can once again help to set a foundation that just makes it so much easier into the future. One of my favorite, workshops to actually run, and I actually think I have a product where I sort of have taken all the notes on how to do this. And so I sort of have the notes and examples of how it can be implemented, but I call it the power of introductions. And how we always should have this thought that we should be constantly reintroducing ourselves. We should constantly be reintroducing ourselves to ourselves and to others, because we evolve and what's important to us also evolves. And so I've worked with some organizations where, or even teams where I sort of take them through this power of introductions, and sort of as simple as building out a slide about themselves. It gets put into this larger set of slides where people can just go through and learn about each other. Can also help to, once again, have that foundation and give people somewhat of a common language. You can also do that by having everyone take a similar assessment. I will say that in terms of assessments, you have to use it properly. I do think that a lot of times assessments are inappropriately leveraged. And so it's really about being very clear about what's the role of this assessment, and making sure that if there's specific language that comes out of the assessment, that people are debriefed properly, and that it's something that they're used. It's not something you just do for one day and then you throw it away. Then that seems like it's a waste of time, energy, and money, and also waste of time of your employees, waste of your employees' time as well. But the key thing though with assessments is not to label people and not to categorize people, because I've, been in situations where people feel like they're going to lose their job if they don't have the right preferences or it doesn't come up the right way. And when you take assessments, if you're not also in the same right frame of mind, you also will take the assessment as you think you should versus the reality. So I can go all day about assessments, but they also can be very useful, I think, if used properly. But ultimately, I think it starts with the individual, and that's the leader. So the leader needs to model this, and they can model it, once again, by having documents. I like to call it sort of their SOP, their standard operating procedures. It's something I also do with my clients, especially if I'm working with them one-on-one sometimes. And this SOP, you can sort of put together this document where you're just writing about, your thinking style, how you tend to make decisions, the things you tend to overlook. Really simple, but can be very helpful for a new employee, and very helpful, if maybe an employee wants to have a difficult conversation with you and they can think about some of the key things to keep in mind. So it can be a Google Doc that's shared, and then you can also have your employees also complete something like that as well, so that you can get to know them a little bit better and use it too. So I think lots of different ways. I think it's going to just depend on where you want to start. But from my perspective, I think that the best investment that any organization, any department lead, any executive, any people manager can make is really thinking very critically about what is and I put this in quotes because it doesn't have to be called this, but like onboarding process is to get everyone on the same page.
I love that you highlighted so many different facets of that, because I think about when you step into a new role, you're like, I don't know how people behave, because what is portrayed externally may not be consistent. And then there's subcultures within the larger organization as well, right? So when you give someone almost like a quote unquote cheat sheet for them, it's like, hey, like FYI, this is a high level overview of what you can expect. And then eventually, like you said, like the language matters, because if you're communicating in different ways, and you're just probably going to have way more communication gaps that create inefficiencies. So I appreciate everything that you call out there. As we slowly wrap up our conversation, if you could leave the audience with one thought, it could be anything, whether it's a way to connect with you or something that you're working on, a gap that you're noticing, what would that thought be?
What comes to mind is that people are businesses. That's something I talk about all the time. I think that we're in a really interesting point. Every two posts on LinkedIn is about AI. And I'm just like, great. But ultimately, it's about people. It's about being able to connect. It's about building relationships. So even if there's less people within an organization, because so many processes have been automated, they still have to be able to interact and connect with each other. And so though I think AI can be really helpful in enabling things, ultimately people need to be thinking about how they're cultivating their awareness, how they're engaging, and how they're calibrating expectations. AI is simply a tool. And so if you're not able to do those elements, AI can't support you in any shape or form, because you have to be able to apply judgment. You have to be able to apply discernment in order for it to be effective. And if you're not self-aware, you're not engaging, and you're not very clear on your expectations, it's completely useless.
Really great call out there. And I have two really big takeaways from our conversation so far: the importance of self-awareness and critical thinking, because a lot of what you're going to navigate it depends. Akua, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your story today. And to everyone else that's tuned into another episode, thank you so much for your time and attention. It means more to me than you'll know, and I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next episode. Till then, stay safe.